This video is part of the OWASP Houston Chapter API Security Study Group sessions. This one covers lab setup. We're going to be looking at Kali Linux, Postman, Burp Suite, Z-Attack Proxy with the Postman add-on, and crAPI. In order to go through and work with API security, we will need a vulnerable application. In this case, we're using crAPI, the completely ridiculous API. We're going to be leveraging Kali Linux, which is a penetration testing tool. It's going to run underneath VMware Workstation Player. Inside Kali Linux, we'll have Postman, Burp Suite Community Edition, and Z-Attack Proxy. We will be installing and configuring Kali Linux on VMware Workstation Player since it is free for personal non-commercial use. For full functionality and free training, you will want to create accounts for Postman and PortSwigger. Please review all the license agreements and terms of usage for all of the products listed on here. The OWASP Houston chapter is part of the OWASP organization. You can go to owasp.org and then the About information to get more insight into the OWASP Foundation. OWASP is the Open Worldwide Application Security Project. It is a nonprofit foundation. We are an open community dedicated to enabling organizations to conceive, develop, acquire, operate, and maintain applications that can be trusted. All of our projects, tools, documents, forums, and chapters are free and open to anyone interested in improving application security. To find the location of the Houston chapter page, go to Chapters, find a local chapter. You can then drill down to North America, scroll down to USA. You will see Houston on the right side. Select that and you will see any upcoming events. You will see our study groups, and if you wanted to see past information on those study groups, you could then select those. This group of study group sessions is looking at API security. You'll want to take a look at the OWASP API Security Top 10 2023, as well as crAPI, the completely ridiculous API. It has labs based on the OWASP API Top 10 2019. We're going to be using crAPI underneath Docker. So Docker and Docker Compose will be installed. It's going to run underneath Kali Linux in our environment. Kali Linux is going to be running on VMware Workstation Player. There will be some prerequisites to validating the signatures for Kali. So we will be using GPG for Win and 7-zip in order to meet those Kali Linux requirements. This video is going to demonstrate each one of the steps required to set up this testing environment. We're now going to download VMware Workstation Player. You will want to make sure that you have reviewed the license requirements. You can see that information down on the VMware Workstation Player site, as well as any of your prerequisites. Inside the frequently asked questions, you'll be able to see the license agreement. VMware Workstation Player is free for non-commercial use. Business and nonprofit use is considered commercial use. We're using VMware Workstation Player for the beginning of these sections so that you can replicate it on your own environment. If you needed more information about what Workstation Player can provide, you can look at the Compare section. Selecting Download for Free will bring up the information about VMware Workstation Player. As of the date of this session, the release date of 2023, October 19th, was the most recent version. Select Go to Downloads on the right side. If you're on Linux or on Windows, choose the appropriate version. Select Read More. That is going to show information about the SHA checksums. So in this case, we are downloading on Windows environment. We're going to want to copy the SHA-256 sum, and we'll be using that for our next steps. I'm going to save my downloaded files into API_lab. It is easier to use a file name and directory structure without spaces when you're using scripting tools such as PowerShell Core that I'll be using in a moment. Once that file has been downloaded, you'll want to then scan it with any tools that you'll need in your environment. Right-clicking on that file, going down to Properties, you will see that Windows by default will block this file. So once we have validated that the checksum is working as expected, we will unblock that. I am on Windows 11 and I have PowerShell Core installed. So I'm using PowerShell 7.3.9 on this system. I'm going to be using get-file hash to compute the checksums. It is installed by default with both Windows PowerShell and PowerShell Core. Going to go into that directory. Going to use some variables in here. Going to say my file name is the file that I'm working with here. I'm going to copy the checksum that I have from the web page here. So CB all the way down to 717. This is lowercase here. I'm going to compute the file hash. The computed hash from Windows will be uppercase. So in this case, we have uppercase and lowercase. When we do a comparison, though, with Windows, the -EQ for strings is going to ignore that case. So our check will come back as the checksums match. If you're on Linux, then your case equality will matter. Since we have successfully validated the checksums, we can unblock the file. So I've unblocked that file. I could then launch the installation setup utility. It's going to prompt to run as administrator. We'll then come up with the welcome to the player setup wizard. Review and accept your license agreement. You have the option of where you want to put it in the path and adding it into the system path. By default, your check for product updates on startup, as well as participating in the Customer Experience Improvement Program, is selected. That will send information back to VMware. I'm unchecking it in my case. Place your shortcuts, and then begin the installation process. Once the installation has completed, you could then license So if you have a commercial license, you would enter it here, or you would skip to leave it blank for non-commercial use, like we're doing here. Then you would click Finish. Depending on how you have set up your environment, you may have some slightly different screens. So I've captured some screenshots from a different installation. I'm going to bring those up so that you could see what I saw at first. Here's the welcome to the setup. If you do not have the VC redistributable installed, it will prompt you to install that. It will need to restart your system before you could then rerun the installer. You will then proceed with the license agreement. On a Windows system, you will be prompted that the Hyper-V role needs to be enabled. It does have the option to automatically install the Windows Hypervisor Platform, WHP, automatically. The rest of the screenshots will be the same. So your custom setup, your user experience, your shortcuts, the installation screens, progress bars, completion, license, and finish. We've completed the installation of VMware Workstation Player now. So we will proceed to taking a look at the Kali Linux documentation for its prerequisites. Now we are ready to proceed to the download of Kali. The main page for Kali is kali.org. There is a download option directly here, but instead we're going to start taking a look at the documentation to look at the prerequisites for extracting and validating the image. The main Kali docs page will have an introduction section, information about the overview, what is it, should you use it, which image should you download, and then the steps to download it. Extremely important information. Never download the images from anywhere other than the official sources. Always be sure to verify the SHA-256 sums of the file you're downloaded against their official values. It's extremely easy for a malicious entity to modify an installation to contain exploits or malware and host it unofficially. So only download from the official Kali Linux images. We're going to be using one of the virtual machine images here. So we will go over in a moment and take a look at the official Kali Linux, VMware, and VirtualBox images. When you're downloading that image, you want to make sure, be very sure that what you're downloading is actually Kali Linux. As a professional penetration tester, having absolute confidence in the integrity of your tools is critical. If your tools are not trustworthy, your investigation will not be trustworthy either. Kali strengths mean that a bogus version of Kali Linux could do a tremendous amount of damage. Again, a tremendous amount of damage if you are not using the properly signed official Kali Linux images. Get Kali. Once you've downloaded it, before you run it, always validate that it really is. You want to make sure that you have validated it as closely as possible. So in order to do that, we're going to go to step 3. Download the signature file and validate that it has been signed with the official Kali Linux private key, and use new Privacy Guard GPG to first verify that the signature is valid, then verify the signed version of the file containing the SHA-256, and continue with validating the SHA-SUM. On a Windows system, you probably don't have GPG installed already, so we're going to be installing GPG Win. And then once you have that downloaded, you can then proceed with the rest of the steps. Select the link for GPG for Win. Copy its SHA-256 sum. We'll be using that to validate shortly. Go to Downloads. By default, it will have download of $15 selected. If you do $0, then it will allow you to download it directly. Notice the steps here. Check your integrity of the installer. So to check the integrity, you can go through and then use the steps listed. You could then check the integrity of the GPG for Win packages here, or you could look at the additional wiki page for integrity checks here. The code signing certificate, we would simply bring up the file, right-click on it, go down to Properties. Again, we do see that it is blocked as expected. Go to your digital signatures, select that digital signature, look at its details. You could see the information right there, and if you wanted to view that certificate, looking at the details of the certificate, you see the version, serial number, so we could see the serial number here matches what we see over here. The valid from and valid to dates on our system, it will be related to our local time. So here we see 2:26, whereas their page shows 8:26 since they're in Europe. And then the valid to, see ours is 6:12 and theirs is 12:12. This is because right now US Central Time is UTC minus 6 hours. So those do match. Go back to our general, unblock it, and we can now run the installation. It will prompt us with our standard UAC. We'll then see the options to start the installation. You can select all of those defaults or change your path as necessary. The installation is now complete. It is now time to proceed to the next step. So we want to now go back to our Kali Linux documentation. Which image should I download? You have different options underneath the Kali Linux download page. Selecting that, recommended, installer or virtual machines. And choose the virtual machine. VMware is on the left side. Check your sum. So copy the checksum. You could look at the docs for installing that pre-made Kali Linux VM. Notice that you do need 7-zip in order to proceed. You could bring up the standard 7-zip website and download it from there. Now we can go and actually get that virtual machine image. So the left side has the download link. Okay. Now we are ready to do the validation steps. So here it said ISO image, that would be for bare metal. We're using the 7-zip, then the file containing the calculated hash, and then the signed version of that. So we would go to our download Kali Linux images securely. We need to first download the SHA-256 sums and the GPG files. It's going to be on the same one as the download server. So here in the download server, go down to current. Here we have our SHA-1s and our SHA-256. So I'm going to download that SHA-256. Notice here we would see all of the SHA entries. If you just click on it, it will just bring it up on a text page. So I need to make sure that I download that. Put that into the API lab directory again. In the API directory now, I have my 7-zip, GPG for Win that I've already installed. There's the Kali 7-zip image. And then here are the two files, GPG and the .text that we just have here. If I wanted to do a get content on that, see the signature, and then there's all of the info. So we have those. Now we need to then import the Kali key. Paste that in, get rid of the extra $sign there. It's going to come back. We see now that the key was imported, total number processed. If I wanted to then check my keys, I could see here, there is my new Kali Linux repository, the information there. Next step is to do the fingerprint. Copy it. If I clear the host and scroll up on this page a bit, paste that in. Now we could see it matches. There's the pub. Okay. We see our expiration date here, 2025. We see the UID, dev Kali. We see the RSA signature on there. Then we can validate the signature for those. This is the signature for the downloaded SHA sums file that we got. So their example, they just had sums. We downloaded ours as sums.txt. So here is the key and then the actual file. Verify it. We see the good signature. So good signature. And our primary key is matching with the key that we saw. Now that we know the calculated sums file is signed by the key provided by the Kali Linux team, we can compute the file hash for the 7-zip download of Kali Linux. That's going to be our file name of Kali Linux 2023.3 VMware AMD 64.7Z. So that's our 7-zip file. If we wanted to then figure out the sum string that we need, we could search for the VMware AMD 64.7Z. There's going to be 2 entries there, the standard one and then the torrent. We want the standard one. So now we're going to use the same type of commands we had with the VMware Workstation Player download. So here's our checksum, matches what we have right there. And we're going to then give it a file name. So our file name is our Kali Linux. Going to then compute the file hash. And finally, we're going to then validate that the checksum matches our computed hash, and it does. So this Kali Linux download is valid. We could then unzip it and begin working with it. It's time to import our pre-made Kali VMware VM into VMware Workstation Player. We will need to unzip with 7Z. So the 7Z format is what our VM image is in. Particular note, if you're on Windows 11, the option will be hidden behind Show More Options. I've changed my registry settings, so it will appear directly for me, just like it did on Windows 10. First, we need to unblock, then extract here. So 7-zip, extract here. If you don't choose extract here, then it's going to create another folder structure, double nested. Whereas if we choose extract here, then it's going to create this folder with all of vmconfig, vmx file. All of the VMDKs have been extracted now. We look at those different types. Here's our VMX, our configuration file that we're going to then be importing. Go ahead and open VMware Workstation Player if you don't already have it running. Open a virtual machine, drill down into the directory where you have Kali Linux. Open that up. Change your settings. By default, it only has 2 gig. I've got plenty of RAM on my system, so I'm going to bump it up to 16 gig. Your number of processors, you could adjust that as necessary. I have 16 logical processors on mine. I'm going to leave it at the 4. It's set up to use NAT for the network address translation, to use the host IP address to connect out. Once we have everything installed and updated, we're going to switch that over to host only so we can't accidentally access something out on the internet. If you need a USB controller, I'm going to go ahead and remove that. I can remove the sound card as well, so I don't need to access those. You go to options. You have the ability to choose a few different things in here. There's all your power. If you wanted to have shared folders, you could enable that or disable it. I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. I'm going to change that to disabled. Click OK. Now, everything's exactly the same way as we would see it in the Kali Linux pages. Then the default user is going to be Kali, and then the password will be Kali. So start up this machine. Depending on your security settings, you may see this about side channel mitigations. It could decrease performance, but would provide enhanced security. If you're on VMware Workstation, you could change that inside of the options. If you're only on Player, then you would need to change that from the VMX file itself. Changing it to full screen. Starting up. We could then log on as crAPI. And begin working with it as normal. We have a running Kali VM, so we need to update and upgrade the components. Depending on how fast your system is, you'll want to allocate 30 to 60 minutes for everything to be up and running. There are a number of updates that have to occur behind the scenes. Once all of that is completed, you'd want to shut down that VM and make a backup of it. If you're using VMware Workstation Pro, you could create a snapshot. If you're using VMware Workstation Player, you want to shut down everything, close Player, and make a copy of that directory. Once you've made a backup of your environment, we can create some new users and groups. We do a user add and call this one just API Lab, so you can use it as a separate user later on. Created the user, added it to the sudo group, changed the shell to bash, looking at etc passwd, user ID 1001, primary group 1001, sudo. In an etc group, we see that both Kali and API Lab are in it, and then the API Lab group. We need to change the password for each one of those. So sudo passwd, API Lab, give it a new password. And running it just for Kali. If you do passwd for it, you do need to have the current password, which is Kali, and then you can change the password as well. Exit out, log back in as the new API Lab user. See API Lab, look at its directory. Here we see bash rc. We don't have any history right now since we just came in here. If we exit out and come back in, bring up our shell again. Now we do see our history from before. Next steps are installing Postman, installing Zap, Docker, Docker Compose, and then crAPI, the completely ridiculous API. Our next step is to install Postman. Go over to the postman.com website. Go to Product. Go to Download Postman. Here we could see the Linux x64. If we download that, it'll put it into our downloads directory by default. We don't want to have to unzip it here, and we want to be able to have an easier symbolic link to it, because Postman here is going to be all uppercase. Instead, what we're going to do is untar that file to /opt. So we need to be in that directory. We're going to untar that, so tar xvzf, so verbose mode, then saying it's a gzip format, and our location. We do need to be sudo, because placing things in the /opt directory does require sudo permissions. Now our next step is to create a symbolic link between the Postman executable and an easier to use lowercase. So by default in /opt/postman, Postman, it's all uppercase, and it's easier just to stick with lowercase. Now if we take a look at which Postman, we see that it is user bin Postman. Looking at that, notice it gives us the symbolic link over to /opt/postman. Now, if we go through and just run Postman by itself, we could either say to skip it, just bring up the lightweight web client. And if we did want to work with collections, environments, we would need to go through and unlock the features by creating a free account. Our next tool that we're going to work with is Z-Attack Proxy, ZAP. ZAP has had a recent update. In October 2023, 2.14 was released. It has support for Postman collections. Also, ZAP is part of the software security project that was announced at the beginning of August. The Quick Start Guide helps you come up to speed with some of the basics of ZAP. We're going to go to the Downloads section, choose the Linux installer. It's going to place it in our Downloads directory, like where we had Postman. We'll open up a command terminal here. We need to add the executable bit to ZAP so that it can run the shell script. Since it will also be placing things in /opt by default, we need to run it as sudo. License agreement first. Choose the standard or the custom. If we take a look at the standard first, standard /opt ZA proxy. It's going to create a symbolic link. Check for the updates on startup, but not automatically download new versions. Check for the updates and automatically install updates for any add-ons, as well as updating for the scan rules. If we go back, choose the custom installation option. Here's the directory. Do you want it to create the symbolic link? Do you want to create a desktop icon? Check for the updates automatically. Notice that automatically is unchecked, just like we saw on the standard installation options. And if we wanted to see if there's new release status for the add-ons, beta or alpha, see the synopsis and everything's the same that we had before. Now we can take a look at where ZAP is running from. So which ZAP SH, so user local bin ZAP SH. And that points to the symbolic link to opt ZA proxy, ZAttack proxy, zap.sh. If we wanted to now see our icon here is ZAP, we could also run it from command prompt as zap.sh. We want to persist the session based on the timestamp. Now we have ZAP installed. Next, we want to install crAPI, the completely ridiculous API. We're going to use a Docker image, so we will need Docker and Docker Compose. We don't have those installed on this system, as we can validate by choosing which Docker -compose. So we will need to install those. We're going to do sudo apt-get install docker.io and docker-compose. Anytime you do run an installation, you want to make sure that there's not any updates or upgrades that need to be applied. So I'm going to run sudo apt update. Okay. And there are some packages that can be upgraded. So I'm going to upgrade those now. In this case, Burp Suite is one of those packages that needs to be updated, and we could see that it is updating it down here. In this case, there are some daemons that were using outdated libraries, so we need to then restart those. Now it does give us a notice that we need to relog on or restart. So we're going to go ahead and do that. I've restarted the system after running the Docker and Docker Compose installations. Now here we could see which Docker, and if we do a docker-v for version, docker-compose, we see its version as well. Now that we have both Docker and Docker Compose working, notice we need to have 1.27.0 or later. We have 1.29.2. For this system, we'll need to curl the Docker Compose YAML file. And then we'll pull it, and then finally we will bring it up. I'm going to resize that slightly. Now I can actually see those commands. I can now see that Docker Compose. I wanted to cat it. I could see the different components from the architecture that are installed. crAPI does have an architecture diagram, so we can come back and look at those at a later time. Since we are in the same folder, it's going to pull back the and on this one, since Docker is running as root, we do need to run it as privileged user for Docker Compose. Everything is now pulled down. So the last step here, so we're going to do our Docker Compose and bring it up. Again, we need to make sure we're using sudo because this environment is using Docker running in root mode. Normally you would want to run Docker in a rootless mode, but we don't have that set up in this environment just yet. While we're waiting for those to come up, we'll bring up another command window here. Now the Docker instances are starting up. So there's the images, the container ID, and then the names that were set up in the Docker Compose file. The ports that it will be responding on. While we're waiting for crAPI to come up completely, let's bring up Zap. And we'll also bring up Firefox. We already had Firefox running here. So here on crAPI, we have it installed. And then to run it, we want to take a look at localhost 8088. And then for MailHog, where we'll use our mail server, that's going to be 8025. crAPI is now up and running, as well as MailHog. Each one of those instances are now up and running. Before we saw Identity, Postgres, Premium Dealership, MailHog, MongoDB. Now it took just a little bit longer for Web, Workshop, Community to come up. Now that we have the environment, we could go over to crAPI here, bring up Firefox tools, so more tools, web developer tools. Look at the inspection down at the bottom. We can look at our network and how things are flowing that way. If we relaunched it, then we'd be able to see that information flowing back and forth. Here's our network. We see all of these GET calls. Each one of the pages you would need to enable dev tools individually and be able to see the different calls that it's making. To make it a little bit easier, what we're going to do is use the Zap heads-up display. So the Zap HUD. I'm going to do a manual explorer. Going to use 8088 crAPI. Going to choose to enable the heads-up display and then launch it. Behind the scenes, we can already see that crAPI is being monitored and data is being tracked. And here, if we go to the sign up page, we'll be able to see that as well. So going back over to Zap, if we look at our history, look at the sites, Zap is already starting to access the information, and then we will be able to start seeing data as it's flowing. If we wanted to go ahead and sign up here just to see the traffic that's coming across, sign up. And I'm going to then go ahead and log out. Now, because of accessing the logon page, I now had identity, API auth, and here in the claim, we could see the information that's being discovered here, and those calls with the request and the response. So we'll start navigating crAPI next time, but we have gone through and validated that each one of these components are working as expected. We have Zap, Docker, Docker Compose, updates on the system. To bring it down, we need to then go with our Docker Compose and do our compatibility, just everything that we had before, bringing it down. We start to see things coming down, those ports being released, and now everything is down. In this session, we set up everything so that we could start working with crAPI next time. So crAPI has different challenges associated with it. We'll be reviewing these different types of challenges. These challenges are related to the OWASP Top 10 2019 version of the Top 10 API Security, which is why you will see those items listed on here. And we will be able to map those over to the Top 10 2023 versions as we go through these labs.